Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and explore the dramatic rise and the tragic fall of a truly brilliant West African empire. We're talking about the Sokoto Caliphate, a state forged by scholars, sustained by poetry, and ultimately dismantled by machine guns.
To really understand this place, you have to look at this quote. There is magic in eloquence and wisdom in poetry. It perfectly captures the intellectual golden age of the 19th century Sokoto Caliphate. You see, this wasn't just some heavily militarized state. It was a highly organized society built deeply on words, intellect, and faith. Part 1. A Kingdom of Poetry in 19th Century West Africa.
Founded by the charismatic scholar Othman Dan Fodio, the Caliphate cultivated a culture where the written word literally reigned supreme. And to make sure this knowledge actually reached everyday people, scholars used something called a jami. Basically, they adapted the Arabic script to write in local languages, like Hausa and Fulfulde. This was a total game changer. It meant complex Islamic texts and beautiful lyrical poems didn't just stay locked away with the elite, they were made accessible to everyone.
Which brings us to Part 2, the scholar Nana Asma'u and a brilliance forged.
Born into this poetry-loving culture in 1793, the caliph's own daughter, Nana Asma'u, became an absolute intellectual powerhouse. Check out this list. She mastered Arabic, Fulfulde, Hausa, and Tamajic. This instantly establishes her genius, right? It gave her this unparalleled ability to communicate across the vastly different cultures living within the empire.
And get this, 10. That is the remarkably young age at which she had completely memorized the Quran. She had such a ferocious zeal for knowledge that she would actually eavesdrop on conversations just to learn the Tamajic dialect, right up until her father finally caved and found her a proper teacher.
As an adult, she wielded her pen with immense power. As the caliphate expanded, Asmau didn't just impose strict rules on new female members joining the empire. Instead, she used cadence and rhythm to inspire them. Take her 1837 work, A Plea to Saintly Women. She beautifully wove stories of pious figures to really activate a sense of wonder and spiritual yearning in her audience.
Let's transition to Part 3, educating the masses and the creation of the Yantaru.
So, Asmau wasn't content to just sit up in an ivory tower keeping all this knowledge to herself. She recognized a massive gap in resources for everyday women, and she actually did something about it. In 1840, she initiated the Yantaru. This was an entire educational movement, a network of traveling women teachers who went out to teach the female masses foundational literacy, Islamic morality, and faith.
These teachers were known as Janji, and they wore a very specific sensory mark of their trade, a distinctive hijab called the malfa. When you saw a woman wearing the malfa, you immediately knew she was an educated leader. It made female education highly visible and deeply respected. Plus, it cleverly bypassed societal critics by allowing women to learn directly from other women, right in the privacy of each other's homes.
And the way they taught was absolutely brilliant. It was an exact scaffolding method used to empower their students. First, the women would memorize rhyming poetry. Then, once they had that rhythm down, they'd learn to write it out in the Arabic script. This unlocked the gateway to actually read and understand the Quran, giving them the ultimate tools for deep self-expression.
Sadly, Nana Asma'u passed away in 1864, deeply mourned by her devoted community. But, as you can see on this timeline, dark clouds were really starting to gather over the empire. By the late 1890s, European imperialism was aggressively encroaching. The British Royal Niger Company attacked neighboring emirates, eventually proclaiming the Northern Nigeria Protectorate in 1900. And by 1903, their sights were set straight on Sokoto. That leads us to Part 4, the British advance, marked by Maxim guns and proclamations. Under High Commissioner Frederick Lagarde, British forces began a relentless expansion into the region. Faced with this impossible situation, Caliph Abdurrahman sent a famously defiant letter to the British in 1902. He stated plainly that there would be no dealings except war. It was a staunch, religiously motivated refusal to submit to foreign Christian rule. But it's important to note that not everyone favored going to war. Many officials, including the subsequent caliph, actually believed in a mass hijra. That's a religious migration across the continent to Mecca, specifically to preserve the religious freedom rather than live under colonial subjugation. The climax of this tension is Part 5, the Battle of Sokoto on March 15, 1903. Before any mass migration could even materialize, the British arrived right at the city gates. And what happened next was a devastating collision of a poetic, spiritual world with the 20th century. Look at this staggering, asymmetrical comparison. You have thousands of brave Sokoto defenders, armed largely with spears, arrows, and old guns. And on the other side, a fraction of that number in British men, but they were advancing in a tight square with 75mm artillery pieces and 4 devastating Maxim machine guns. It shows exactly what happens when medieval weaponry meets modern, mechanized slaughter.
Faced with these impossible odds, many of the Sokoto defenders bravely chose martyrdom. We see this perfectly in the tragic anecdote of the Maji Dadadi, a high-ranking official. Right before the fighting began, he approached the caliph and requested the Goran Yaki, the ceremonial kola nut of war. Accepting this nut signaled his absolute intention to die a martyr. He and his young squire then charged headlong, directly into the machine gun fire, perishing together.
It was an absolute massacre. Look at this number, 2. That is the mere number of hours it took for the British forces, using their artillery and machine guns, to completely break the Caliphate's resistance and occupy the great city. Think about that. A century of sovereign, intellectual, and Islamic rule was physically shattered in just 120 minutes. The Caliph fled, and the British installed a puppet ruler.
So, we have to ask ourselves, when an empire falls to the sword, does its spirit survive in the pen? The British may have physically conquered Sokoto in 1903, but did they truly erase the magnificent intellectual legacy left behind by scholars like Nana Asma'u? I'd argue no. Her poetry is literally still recited today, and her educational foundations for women continue to echo throughout modern West Africa. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this leaves you wanting to learn even more about this incredibly dramatic and fascinating chapter of history.